Welcome everyone to today's program From the Cortex to the Classroom. It's part of our Thought Leadership webinar series at Amplify for Core Knowledge Language Arts and mCLASS. I'm going to introduce the main event in a second, but just first want to go over some housekeeping issues. So today will be, it'll be about 45 to 50-minute presentation, and we're going to try to save 10 minutes for questions at the end. If you have a question at any point, just make sure you just type it right in to the chat area here, right in the control panel on the right. Also, I want everyone to know that we will be recording today's webinar, so you don't have to take notes. We'll be sending it to you, and we also have some other papers and some good material to keep sharing with you. Some of you probably are more familiar with Amplify than others, but just really quickly before I hand it over to Carolyn, just want to go over a couple things about Amplify. We are a leading provider of K-8 education. Since 2000, we provide core and supplemental materials for ELA, science, and math. We like to say we are the program for teachers. We are very teacher-centric and always looking to provide teachers with the tools they need to help students in the classroom and respond to needs. So now it's time to kind of get going, and going to read the bio of our presenter today. Really excited about this. Dr. Carolyn Strom is an educator and classroom researcher whose work focuses on improving early literacy outcomes and reading experiences for young children. Her work centers on bridging the divide between scientific research and instructional practice, and she collaborates widely with teachers, school districts, curriculum developers, educators around the world. She's leading an initiative for New York City preschool teachers called Cortex to Classroom. That's where the title comes from. And her recent work also includes tools or toys, a framework for curating early reading apps. She has been named as one of the 67 influential educators who are changing the way we learn. I'm curious about that 67 number. I have a feeling she'd make like the top 50 list, but in any case, really pleased to present Carol.
Thank you so much. So I'll start sharing my screen now. Oh, sorry about that. Should be at the very beginning. Okay, just making sure that everyone can see me and see the screen. Julia or Greg, can you give me just like a sign? Because I can't see.
Here, everything looks great.
You can see in here? Okay, so I'm just gonna get started. Welcome. The title of this presentation is Cortex to Classroom, Understanding How the Brain Learns to Read. And I just wanna go over this is gonna have 3 parts. Part 1 is the big picture. I'm going to talk briefly about the reading problem just to get us all on the same page. Then I'm going to talk about part 2, one solution, which is to refine the professional knowledge of teachers and build capacity. We're going to be talking about 2 different, hold on one second, sorry, I'm just having a little bit of technical problems here. Okay, got it. So part 2, I'm going to talk about a solution, refining professional knowledge to build capacity. And then in part 3, I'm going to talk about some guidelines for using structured literacy approach and nonverbal memory pathways. So for part 1, we're just going to jump right in. I'm going to talk about the big picture and the reading problem. Many of you may be familiar with the reading crisis in our country, but I just want to show sort of an image that really drives it home. So when we think about the big picture around reading, where are we as a country with reading achievement? The bottom line is that we're not meeting the educational needs of our youngest and most vulnerable readers. So if you look at the 2015 National Association for Educational Progress records on fourth grade reading assessment, we had 64% of kids not proficient. I'll say that again because it just always boggles my mind that we live in the healthiest and wealthiest country and we still have 64% of fourth graders, that's more than half of fourth graders, not reading at grade level by the time they're 9, compared with 36% who are proficient. So every time I look at this, I just think to myself, I just can't believe that we have so many kids falling through the cracks before their 9th birthday. And it hasn't really gotten better. This has really pretty much stayed the same for the last 20, 25 years. And it's what drives me in my work, and I assume it's what drives a lot of us as educators, that, again, how can we be living in the healthiest and wealthiest country with more technology than ever and still only have 64% of kids proficient? And it's really, you know, it's a tragedy, especially because we have so much research and we know in reading what works. And for some reason, the research to practice divide just really hasn't been connected. There hasn't been a firm enough bridge. And in my work, I really try to address this bridge. So we know that in terms of the big picture, kids are obviously having difficulties with reading related skills. That's really common. We know, again, because so many kids are not proficient, more than half. And if we look at the population as a whole, we actually know that about 15 to 20% of the population have some of the symptoms of dyslexia. That's not to say that 15 to 20% have dyslexia, but they have some of the symptoms of dyslexia. And that's where we get the 1 in 5 statistic. We know also that dyslexia is one of the most common learning disabilities, if not the most common, depending on how you're defining learning disability. And of the students who qualify for special ed, we know, because of a learning disability, we know that 80% of them have specific difficulties in reading and language processing. So not only are we, you know, just like not meeting the needs of our kids, but we know really that so many of their needs stem from reading, right? And so reading, these reading related skills. And that's why we're all here and we're all concerned about our children. So before we sort of dive into the real science of it, I want us to put a face on the numbers. And if everyone who's listening can just think of a child or an adult who you know who's having difficulty with reading or who's had difficulty in the past. And if you could draw a quick picture of this person, maybe imagine them in your mind if you don't have something to draw with right now, or pull up a picture of them on your phone. Maybe it's a student you're working with and you have a picture of them, or maybe it's your own child. And if you could just draw a quick little sketch of them. If you're listening to this in a group, then feel free to show someone your picture. But really, as you draw this, I'd love it if you could think about how does this person approach reading? And most importantly, how do they feel? So perhaps some of you drew a picture of a kid who looks like this. Has their hand on their head, visibly frustrated, or a picture like this with their fingers in their mouth, nervous, right? Maybe they always have to go to the bathroom during reading, or they always, you know, find themselves distracted during reading because they have trouble with it. You know, and we want kids to feel like this, our kid in the yellow shirt. We want kids to love to come to school and want to read, but we know that whenever you're struggling with anything in life, right, you begin to not enjoy it so much. We want kids to look like this, again, and be excited, but too often we have kids that look like this, right? Not because they don't want to be able to read, but because it is so difficult for them that they are emotionally checking out. And this is what I like to call the collateral damage, the emotional collateral damage of not being able to read. So for all the kids who struggle with learning to read, we know that not only are they having this cognitive difficulty, academic difficulty, they have this other lug of emotional collateral damage that they're carrying around. And if you think about how you feel when something's hard for you, right, of course you don't want to do it. One of the assessments that I give when I'm doing research with kids is it's an emoji survey, and kids circle which emoji they identify with and how do they feel about reading, how do they feel when their teacher asks them to read, and they circle one of the emojis. So for your sample kid, if you could just right now think about which emoji they would circle. And I'll just tell an anecdote of a child I was recently doing some research with. He told me that the emoji didn't exist on my survey, and that, and he was going to have to draw his own. And I said, what emoji am I missing here? And he said the tear emoji, the face with the tear. Because that's just, he cries. He has to swallow his tears when he's even just going in a small group with his teacher, because even though he's only 7.5, it's just been so much failure and so much failure. So again, with the big picture, I just wanted to, talk about the statistics of how 64% of kids we're failing them. They're not learning to read, and also just to think about they're beyond the numbers, right? These are individual kids with now emotional damage, and the earlier that we get to them, and the earlier that we apply the reading science, the greater chance we have to help them avoid this situation of feeling bad about themselves. So that was part one, the big picture, which I know isn't the most uplifting news, but the rest of the presentation is going to be more positive. But I'm hoping that by starting with the problem, you guys also feel, everyone listening, that we can all be a part of the solution. We really need to admit that there's a problem, right, until we go forth with the solutions. So in the next part here, I'm going to talk about one solution that I'm particularly passionate about, which is refining our professional knowledge to build capacity. So I think a lot about how when you go to the doctor, they are somehow up on the latest medical studies, and people are always talking about, oh, they just did this big clinical trial and they're finding out all these things, and the medical field seems so constantly informed research and practice. And somehow, I don't know what it is about our profession, but there's all this amazing neuroscience and cognitive psychology and all this great educational research, but somehow it doesn't make its way to practice. It doesn't make its way to the classroom. And on the other hand, there's all these people doing exciting things in the classroom. I feel like breakthroughs, innovations in the classroom, and then those people aren't somehow having links to researchers who can hopefully publicize their work. So I'm really interested in building capacity and refining professional knowledge, both in the researchers and classroom teachers, and bringing those two things together. So I'm going to talk about reading instruction now, specifically with insights from one, cognitive psychology, which is how the mind works, and then neuroscience. So I wanted to include an inspiring image of the brain to contrast with some of the more not depressing, but reality images we just talked about. So as we delve into the cognitive psychology pieces, I want us to do a reading exercise to try to understand what it feels like to be in the process of developing foundational reading skills. We talked about what it feels like emotionally, but what does it feel like in your brain? What does it feel like on a cognitive level? So I want you to try the reading exercise below and try to decipher it, but really try to understand what is making this difficult, and what do you notice your mind doing in response to this task? So just give you a little moment to try to read this. So again, as adults, I think we've had decades of practice reading, but we can forget how hard it is to read a simple passage. And so I think doing an exercise like this can remind us what it feels like to be a young reader. This is a moment I would love to see what's coming up in the chat, how people are feeling about this reading. Okay, nothing in the chat. So maybe this is fairly easy for everyone to read, but usually when people try to read this, it's this experience of you can kind of read it, you sort of recognize some patterns, like you might recognize that this is the word were, maybe this looks like down, maybe this looks like but really usually it's hard to even make your way through the whole passage because it's such a frustrating experience. And what typically makes this so difficult is you don't know the sound symbol correspondences. So you might be recognizing these symbols, but you don't know what sounds they make. And so I'm going to read it to you, and maybe it'll start to make some sense. But it says, they were looking down upon a lovely valley. There were green meadows on either side of the valley. And along the bottom of it, there flowed a great brown river. Halfway along the river, there was a tremendous waterfall with a whole mass of enormous glass pipes dangling down. And again, this is not actually that difficult. It's from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So this is the passage. It's written in the International Phonetic Alphabet. So hopefully it looked kind of similar to you than to English, but you know, it sort of simulates the experience of what it feels like to sort of see words and recognize that they're symbols, and maybe you should know how to say them, but you don't. And that's really how so many young and struggling readers feel. Just as a contrast, here it is, written in English, translated. And you know, it's not such a hard text, but what makes it hard on the left is the word recognition, right? The comprehension isn't that hard. It's not that hard to understand. However, if you can't break the code, breaking the code is going to be taking so much mental energy that you're going to have a really difficult time understanding what it actually means. So the dimension of reading that we're illustrating here is decoding and word automaticity, right? So this isn't all of reading, but this is what really holds a lot of kids back, which is decoding and automaticity. And what we know over and over from cognitive psychology is that there's two dimensions of reading. One is the word recognition dimension, which I just was discussing and sort of modeling, the sound and word level, really just decoding. And the other level is, I'm having some, okay. The other level is the spoken language comprehension, the sentence and discourse level. So what we're really going to be talking about is kids who have difficulty with word recognition, which is, again, one domain, one piece of learning to read, but we also don't want to ignore language comprehension, right? So you want to be able to identify words, that's word recognition, but you also obviously have to understand language. In the prior example I showed, that was really an example of word recognition troubles. The challenge wasn't language comprehension. The challenge really there is word recognition. And ideally, we want kids from the ages of 0 to 8 to be kind of fluently moving through word recognition and language comprehension, and then coming around 8 to a really fluent, age 8, to a fluent place. So usually at this point, people ask, where does dyslexia fit in? If we think about dyslexia, it's usually characterized by difficulties with word recognition, spelling, and verbal memory, not so much with language comprehension. So if you think about this graph where the x-axis is word recognition and the y-axis is language comprehension, dyslexia usually shows up over here, meaning that kids have really high language comprehension, but really low word recognition. So that means they can understand something like a Harry Potter, but they might not be able to read something like the cat sat on the mat, right? And so that's where they would fall on this graph. Because again, the sort of main thing to take away here is reading isn't just one thing. It's composed of word recognition, reading words on the page, but also language comprehension. So one little classroom tip that I often give to teachers around this is that first, always figure out which specific domain of reading a struggling student is struggling with, right? So struggling readers are not all the same. There are some struggling readers who have really high language comprehension and their problem is word recognition. And then there are kids who have excellent word recognition, who are actually very fluent readers, but they really don't understand what they're reading. And so they have a different issue and therefore need different instruction. So before, when I go into a school and work with teachers, I really always want us to first do assessments to figure out what is the challenge for this kid. Is it word recognition or is it language comprehension? You want to isolate the problem, right? If you go to a doctor to figure out a problem, you want to isolate, you want to rule out what it is and what it isn't. So another way to think about this is that automatic word recognition is what we want kids to develop by 8, right? So they're not falling through the cracks at 9 like we started talking about at the very beginning. And we know that automatic word recognition in English develops over years, right? So really from birth with oral language through 3, you're building the oral language and you're building visual recognition of symbols. But through ages 4 to 8, which is why this is yellow, those are like the highlighted years. Those are so important. That 4-year period is just absolutely critical to learning to read. And it doesn't happen overnight, particularly in English because it's so complicated. So what we know from a lot of the science lately is that in Italy, in Spanish-speaking countries and in Italian-speaking countries, it doesn't take as long to read because their code is less complex. But in a code like English, which is more complex and has many exceptions, learning to read fluently happens over at least 4 years. So, you know, decades of research in cognitive psychology have told us this, that we know that word recognition happens over several years and actually happens in a lot of different phases and in parallel with spoken language and spelling development. So I'm going to go over sort of these 3 major periods. One period has 2 parts, so you'll see 4 little distinctions, but I'm going to go over the periods of reading, and you can think of these as milestones in terms of how reading develops. So these are known as the phases of reading or periods. So the very first period is the pre-alphabetic period. And this can happen at the age of 2 or 3 or 4. And the pre-alphabetic period is when children are reading, but they're not using alphabetic cues. So they're pre-alphabetic. So they might see a word like look, and they would recognize it because these 2 O's look like eyes, right? So they look at it and they said, oh, I know that's the word look, but they're not using the ul or the k. They're using the fact that the shape of the letters O that happen to look like eyes, and it reminds them to look. In the pre-alphabetic phase, kids might also be recognizing common signs such as Starbucks. One time when I was assessing a child who was around 6 and having difficulties with reading, the mom said, you know, I don't know what's wrong with him. He was reading since he was 3 years old. And I said, what was he reading at 3? And she said he would point at Starbucks and say Starbucks. Right? And that is a kind of reading, but it's pre-alphabetic reading, which means that they're using context and visual symbols. So in this situation, it was a great sign that he understood that this green circle meant something other than a green circle. It meant coffee, it meant somewhere you go, but he wasn't actually reading. He was in the pre-alphabetic period, which is essential, right? It's essential to be in this period where you recognize that these symbols carry meaning, but we really want to move kids to the alphabetic period. So the second period, period 2A, is partial alphabetic. In the partial alphabetic, if you think about, we had the word look over here. Now a child might see the word look and say look. However, when they see a word like lock, guess what they'll also say? Look. Right? So in the partial alphabetic period, a lot of children just look at the initial and final letter. So they read anything that starts with an L and ends with a K as look. So lock is look and lack is look, right? And then you also might see that showing up in spelling. They write look LK, they write like LK, they write lake LK, they write lick LK. So a real key characteristic of the partial alphabetic phase is lack of vowels. It's very common in the partial alphabetic phase for kids to be using initial and final letters and not using vowels. And it's very important that if kids are at this phase, right, we focus on instructing on medial vowels. So in period 2B, they're still in the alphabetic phase, but it's the full alphabetic phase. And in this period, they're certainly reading words like shook, and now they can analogize, which is really exciting and important. They can read words like shook, right? So they can see that look ends with the O-OK and shook ends with the O-OK. So look, if I know look, then I know shook. Then I know stood. So what they're doing here is they're taking this vowel digraph, and they're analogizing to stood. Now, the problem that a lot of kids run into in the full alphabetic period that we've seen over and over in the research is that, you know, vowel digraphs are tricky. And whereas OO says in stood, it says oo in stool, and it says oo in shoot. So figuring out when OO says And when OO says ooh is one of the biggest challenges for kids in the full alphabetic period. The vowel digraphs, which are when two vowels make one sound, are really what makes English complicated. And so many kids, the majority of kids, really can make it through the pre-alphabetic and the partial alphabetic, but they have such a difficult time making it through the full alphabetic. And it really stems from this challenge with vowel digraphs, is what we've seen over and over again. The final period really is period 3, which is called the unitized sort of phase, sometimes called consolidated. And that's really where kids are working on multisyllabic words. So now they've read look, they can read it automatically, but now they're analogizing and going even further and reading words like outlook and adulthood and bookshelf and aloof and kookaburra, right? And aloof and kookaburra were lifted from an early 3rd grade text. And I chose them because those are perfect examples of when a child will come to these words in 3rd grade and need to learn new vocabulary. And they have this opportunity to learn this new vocabulary, but they're going to have a really hard time learning the vocabulary if they don't know how to pronounce the word. If they haven't learned phonics and know that OO can say ooh, then they're not going to be able to read aloof. They're going to sit there and be like, Allah. They're not going to have the decoding skills to make this word work for them. And now they've not only lost out on a successful decoding opportunity, they've lost out on learning a new vocabulary word. And same thing with kookaburra, right? And so really where we want kids to be is we want them to make their way through period 3 by the end of 2nd grade and just be reading multisyllabic words so that they can really spend the next year just building just purely fluency. So the classroom tip 2 here is that knowing what phase a reader is in is critical to understanding what kind of instruction they need. And here I really point to formative and diagnostic assessment. So you need to know that if a kid is reading, short vowel words, but they're struggling with vowel digraphs, that means that they're really in the full alphabetic phase. So the essence of the instruction there should be vowel digraphs. We shouldn't be working on multisyllabic words with kids if they're all the way in the partial alphabetic, right? So really knowing what a phase is even more critical. I know a lot of teachers are really passionate about getting the kids reading level, and that certainly is good information, but it should really be in conjunction with actually knowing what period a child is in and what kind of letter sound correspondence and what kind of phonics program they need. So we also know, and there's really exciting research that came out just last year, we also know that kids decoding really runs in parallel with their spelling. So decoding and encoding are reciprocal, and they develop in parallel. So just to sort of think about this, if you could try to figure out what this says. So hopefully maybe someone figured out I'm looking in the chat to see if there are any guesses. This says octopus. So the child here has the but really doesn't hear the k, oct. So this says octopus. So he's missing a vowel here and a consonant here, but he does get the general idea. And spelling, as much as reading assessment, can also tell us what period they're in. So one of the things I'm recommending here is, in addition to reading assessment, that using informal spelling or formal spelling assessment is so critical to understanding the phases that a child is in. So another example, if you can try to read this and figure out what this says. One of my students the other day guessed that this said, it's my ride. But it actually says just married. Oh my gosh, Florence, I can see a question. I see, Florence is listening and she understood that it said just married. That's amazing. I'm guessing that you've taught kindergarten or 1st grade for a really long time and are really good at deciphering this kind of writing. But again, this tells us a lot. They have consonants, right? They actually even have some vowels here. Married. They're just missing that And again, my point is that, early spelling or encoding can really help us understand a child's spelling, child's reading. Why? Because decoding and encoding are really related, and the research in cognitive psychology is just supporting that over and over. So let's move to a little bit of a harder one. This is from a child in early 2nd grade. And it's a little visually hard to read, so I've translated it here for you. So try to read it, and while you're trying to read it, try to figure out where you would start maybe with phonics instruction with this child. Tanya, yes, one day I was riding on a horse, it was raining. So this says, one day I was riding on a horse, it was raining, and my boot started to fall off. So here we know, right, that the child is struggling with those S clusters. Started, he wrote it out as swerted, to fall off. I started, so again, we see the R consonant clusters. Although this might be a speech thing, we also know that we can help remedy that with phonemic awareness, right, and phonics instruction. I started to try to put my boot back on, but just then I realized it was unsafe while riding. So I stopped, and finally it fell to the ground. Then the lady who was leading us put my boot on the, can anyone get this one? Where the lady put his boot? Yes, James, the curb. This is the word curb, cob, right? So we're seeing here, there's a bunch of examples where the is really hard for the child to hear, and then thus becomes hard for the child to spell. So automatically, just from analyzing the spelling, we know that our blends here started, try, and now here curb, our controlled vowel, would be a great place to start with explicit phonics. I laughed and laughed, and Michelle got it, right? I thought it was hilarious. So here the problem really isn't hearing the vowels so much in a couple places. Not really, excuse me, trouble hearing the vowels, but really some of these consonant clusters, right? So still in the alphabetic phase, and really working on these consonant clusters, as well as some vowel digraphs. So classroom tip 3 here is that explicit attention to spelling really needs to be a part of all literacy instruction, as well as any specialized reading instruction for kids with language-based learning disabilities, of which we know there are many, right? Brings us back to the very beginning. We know that there's a lot of kids who have these difficulties, and we often think reading instruction is somehow separate from spelling instruction, and really they're so related, and we know that from the research. So I wanted to make sure that that was a tip that we talked about. So we've talked about the big picture and the reading problem and the emotional collateral damage, and we're in the middle of talking about part 2, one solution, which is to refine our professional knowledge. And I was talking about the cognitive psychology and what we know about how the mind processes words and how reading and spelling are linked. And now I want to talk about the neuroscience. So cognitive psychology deals with the brain, and the neuroscience really looks at brain imaging to get inside the brain. So just really quickly, if you can just draw what you think of when you think of the brain learning. So where do you think that reading happens in our brain? Reading is one of the most complex acts that our brain engages in. So where does reading happen? So it's a little bit of a tricky question because reading doesn't happen in one place. And I'm going to just give like a 10-second overview of the brain. And I'm sure a lot of people know this, but just to get everyone on the same page, when we think of the brain, and maybe in your little drawing you drew this, that we have 2 hemispheres. We have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And we have 4 lobes with designated regions in those lobes. And in the lobes, our lobes are composed largely of gray matter. So that's sort of the layout, the overall landscape of the brain. And then we know from modern brain imaging methods that there isn't a single region responsible for reading. Rather, there are various cortical areas that activate when we decipher words. So it was a little bit of a trick question to draw, where does reading happen? Because it doesn't happen in one area. It's actually happening in a lot of different cortical areas. So what we know is that we have these bundles of nerves, or white matter highways, as I tell my students, that serve to connect the gray matter, connect these different areas of the brain and create a reading circuit. So we're not wired for reading in the same way that we're wired for speaking. We actually have to build a circuit. So if you think about here, this is just the left hemisphere, which I'm showing because that's really where all of our language processes take place. So here is the left hemisphere, and here are the 4 lobes. And these regions of the lobes are the areas that are most involved in learning to read. So in the occipital lobe is vision. We have to be able to see the words in order to read. This is vision. This area in the frontal lobe has to do with speech and spoken language. So to be able to understand what we're actually reading. And the parietal lobe here links speech and sound. So these are 3 different areas of the brain that we need to wire. And these are really connecting spoken language networks as well as written language networks. So this is not an easy task, right? This is something really, really hard. And another way of thinking about this looks like this. So this is from a book that I recommend highly called Reading in the Brain. Oops. Sorry. And the green networks here and the orange networks here are the spoken language networks, which we are wired for, right? You think about a baby is born and they're wired to speak. No one has to teach them to speak. They're wired to speak. We're wired to connect through our oral language. However, in order to read, we need to channel the red area, which is the visual area of our brain, and we're not wired to do that. The example that I give all the time is that if you took babies and you brought them to a desert island and you left them there for 10 years, and I know that's very depressing and hard to think about, but just theoretically, if you did that and came back 10 years later, they all would have learned to speak in some way. They may grunt, they may point, but they will have developed some level of oral language. They will not have invented the alphabet. The alphabet took us tens of thousands of years to develop. We were speaking as human beings way before we were writing and reading. So we're wired for oral language. We're wired for these orange and green networks. We're not wired for the red area to connect it. So my classroom tip 4 here is to remember and remind your students, particularly the ones who struggle, that our brains are not wired for reading. What they're doing is really difficult. And we have to wire our brains to do this. And it takes a lot of cognitive energy. And the good news is that our brains are plastic. So when working with young children, and I can't see my camera, although it would help me if I could. Oh, there it is. When working with young children, I often use these. These are stuffed neurons. So I use 3 of them, 1, 2, 3, to sort of explain that we have these 3 areas of our brain that we're using to learn to read, and we have to connect them. And the good news is that our brains are plastic. So often to remind children, our brains are plastic, so fantastic, just like elastic, changes can be drastic. To really let kids know that what they're doing when they're trying to learn to read is hard. They're not wired for it. They have to connect these 3 sets of neurons. But the good news is that our brain is plastic and we can do this. However, as we know from statistics, is that a lot of kids aren't doing this, aren't learning how. So just to kind of sum up here, because I've gone through the key findings from the neuroscience pretty quickly. We're not totally done, but I wanted to sum it up for a little bit. We know that we have these white matter highways, which are the connective networks that sort of work together to form the network, right? And with children with word reading difficulties, this network is simply not as strong. Their gray matter may be less dense, and or the white matter highways connecting these gray matter areas may be less effective, perhaps smaller or slower. And this I just feel like has been, I show a version of this to young children to help them understand like that they have these networks that have to come and work together. And it's really, really hard, but so rewarding. It just takes a lot of practice. So I'm going to show you a video just to drive this point home, since there are so many kids who struggle with learning to read and who struggle to bring these areas of our brain together. This is a short video that really talks about the arcuate fasciculus, which is the white matter highway that connects these gray matter areas. Okay, so that's from the Harvard group's Usable Knowledge in a Minute, and the Usable Minute, What is Dyslexia? And so I highly recommend their videos, which sort of, again, and I found that parents really respond to these videos a lot. Sort of it just kind of simplifies it and brings it home. So one last point about what else does brain imaging tell us. And again, I know so many of you are probably familiar with this, but in terms of brain imaging, right, we know that this is typically a child with a word reading difficulty has an underactivated area in the rear left hemisphere during reading. And this makes sense because these are areas concerned with phonological components of language and with sound symbol connections. But we know to sort of figure all the way on the right, we know that with explicit instruction and structured literacy programs that are using multisensory methods, brain activation levels can change, right? So again, this is what I went back to, and I saw someone in the questions wanted me to repeat this, but you know, telling young children our brains are plastic, so fantastic, just like elastic, changes can be drastic. And again, changes with a lot of hard work. So we know that our brains have a certain level of plasticity, and with structured literacy programs that use multisensory methods, brain activation levels can change. And I saw in one of the, I was just quickly reading through during the video, one of the comments was saying that, you know, there isn't just one way to, you know, get at the sound symbol connections, of course. There's so many different pathways to learning and so many different ways to teach sound symbol correspondences. There isn't just one way, but the important thing is that we're doing it through multiple pathways. So the last piece, I know we're sort of right at the edge of time here, but the last piece is really a structured literacy approach, and all of the research is really pointing to a structured literacy approach, which really explicitly addresses 6 building blocks of language. And we know that it's not enough to simply address these components. We must use visual and multisensory pathways when teaching, especially in order to compensate for kids who have weaknesses in language areas. And so, you know, an area that I really focus on my work with young children is getting the sound symbol association down, which is the alphabetic principle. So I just wanted to share one multisensory strategy or way to make sort of phonemes concrete. That's from a lot of new research that's coming out, but specifically from a study in 2014 that found that kids who use mouth gesture cards, so they can look like this, right? This is from Linda Mood Bell, emphasizing the s and the z are made in the similar parts of the mouth. This is from a classroom that I worked in where the kids decided that they wanted to make their own mouth gesture cards. This is from a digital program that actually has kids being able to, click and play and hear the sounds while they're watching a mouth make it. And this is an animation, which is not as strong because it can't be as subtle with mouth gestures. But I just wanted to point everyone to this study from 2014, which is all about orthographic mapping, which is just a scientific way of saying sound symbol connections. And really, they are talking a lot in this study about how mouth gesture cards, kids who learned about how to form phonemes in their mouth, they, by looking at mouth gesture cards, outperformed kids who learned letter sounds without mouth gesture cards. They also talk about a lot of other strategies that if we had a great amount of time, I would share. But I just wanted to share some, small multisensory strategy here that you could take away and realize that really, we know that teachers need to work closely with speech language pathologists too, who often have these pictures on hand, because kids who use mouth gesture cards, it really helps them understand the phonemes better, which are such an abstract concept, and we need to make them more concrete. So I know I rushed through a lot of things, sorry, but I wanted to now, I guess I'll pull up the chat. Okay, just trying to go in order. But Julia, maybe you can. All right, I have one question. I'm very disturbed by the implications of the simple view of reading be presented here. I invite you to read the recent, yes, Catherine Snow, familiar. More Bond's work on the importance of presenting explicit instruction within the context. Disability. It's a long one. Okay, yes, great point. So yes, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that. So you definitely, with the phase model, would not limit kids' access to multisyllabic words, right? So if a kid is in the pre-alphabetic or partial alphabetic phase, there's no reason to limit their access to multisyllabic words. You're not hiding those from them. The idea is just, you don't want to, a lot of times people follow a program and are just on lesson 6.5, 6.6, and are moving on and haven't assessed kids, so they're not exactly matching instruction to the early, to exactly what the kid needs. But you never want to limit, especially a kid who's older, you don't want to limit their exposure to multisyllabic words. So that definitely was not what I was implying there. And yes, always teaching in multisensory ways and different pathways.
Hi, Carolyn. This is Greg. Maybe do you want to? One of the questions that came in is how can we distinguish between kids with reading difficulties and those with dyslexia? Right.
It's a great question. So the interesting part is a lot of times they present the same, right? So kids who have word reading difficulties often show up in the same way that kids who have dyslexia show up. So right now, there's no absolute way that you can get a diagnosis of dyslexia without a screener or some sort of neuropsych evaluation. But what I always tell teachers is oftentimes the remediation is the same. So the most important thing is doing a diagnostic assessment and figuring out what area of word reading difficulty they're having. I know that doesn't completely answer your question, but so many kids really display the same symptoms. So it doesn't really matter what you label it, as long as you're figuring out what exactly they need and then you're remediating for that. But I do have some, I can send you some dyslexia screeners if you want to email me. I can send you that. That might help. I don't know what age kids you teach. I can't see any of these questions, so.
Yeah, I've got another one for you. This is Greg again. Let's see. How about, yeah, so one that just came in is, can you give some more examples of the multisensory approach that that would help folks on the call here?
Yes, exactly. So it really depends on the age of the kids. But one example is, like, we always think about clapping syllables, right? But there's lots of things you can do with your bodies, right? You can do the head, shoulder, waist with your syllables, or with phonemes. So a lot of times with phonemes, people, when you're dividing up phonemes, people really stick to tapping, right? You see here teachers say all the time, tap it out, but there's so many different ways you can do it. You can slap it out down your arm, you can tap it out on your head. So there's different physical multisensory things you can do. The other the other method that I would really direct you to is integrated picture mnemonics for the alphabet. So a lot of times people teach the alphabet using associated cues, sort of putting a symbol next to an object and then having them linked, or try to associate them. But an integrated cue is when a picture is actually embedded in a letter. So it's called integrated picture mnemonics. A lot of times, the research I'm doing right now actually is in a pre-K that's using an integrated picture mnemonic, and it really draws on dual coding. So I would recommend that, really integrated picture mnemonics for any child that's struggling to link sounds and symbols, as well as the more gross motor, not just fine motor, for phonemic awareness.
Okay, maybe one more that just going through here. How do you suggest meeting all the different needs in a classroom with many levels of readers in different phases?
God, that's the million-dollar question. If we could answer that right here, we would solve every single problem in education. I think, at least I was in the classroom for 10 years, and that was definitely the hardest, the biggest challenge, right, was meeting all of the different needs. And from working with teachers right now, the one thing that I can say is really figuring out, using formative and diagnostic assessment, figuring out first what really they need, and then trying to set up your classroom in ways that kids have a lot of independence throughout the day to really work at their own levels. So to try to move away from whole teacher one lesson as much as possible. Of course, you're going to give those lessons, but trying to move into a classroom where kids are independently working at their level as much as they can, is really the way to do it. And the way that I usually direct teachers, and I've had some success doing that, is by really honing in on diagnostic assessment and knowing exactly, let's say you have 30 kids in your class, really knowing exactly each of their learning profile in terms of assessment is really the first step. Oftentimes we use summative assessment, and we know that these kids are at a level F or a reading level, these kids are at a level G, these kids are a level M, but you don't actually know the specific skills that those kids are working on. But again, obviously that's the million-dollar question in education, and someone like Salman Khan of Khan Academy would answer that, in that every kid should really always be working on the one thing they need to work on, and really, individually. Which I think is where eventually people are going in some kind of a way in education. But that's ideally what we want. We want kids all working on the edge of what they need to know.
Okay, so I think that's it for the questions. Some other comments have come in, and Carolyn, we'll share them with you later, just so that and then some other folks have asked some questions just about Amplify. So just want everyone to know we will be getting in touch with everyone who attended. We will be sharing the recording and also getting you other information. So just to wrap up too, wanted to tell everyone that there's 2 upcoming webinars, one on systematic phonics instruction by Susan Lambert, and the other is introducing our core knowledge language arts curriculum presented by Jeff Danmiller. We will share all this information, but you can see that they're coming in November 7th and November 13th. And yeah, and we just really thank everyone for attending and want to thank Carolyn for doing a fantastic job. Learned a lot. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon.